It didn't begin with the shouting. It never does. No, it began a week earlier with a birthday invitation. A brunch, Daniel had said. Just something simple, he added over the phone. Ashley's organizing it, but we'd really like you there, Mom. It wouldn't be the same without you. I believed him. So I dressed that morning with care. I pressed the sleeves of my pale blue silk blouse, twisted my silvering hair into an elegant bun, clasped my gold bracelet, the one Daniel gave me after he passed the bar exam. It had cost him more than he could afford back then, and I wore it like a talisman ever since. The restaurant was one of those high-ceilinged places downtown, minimalist decor, polished concrete, curated playlists, Ashley's style, not mine. I walked in 5 minutes early and spotted them across the room, Daniel standing, phone in hand, gesturing toward the waiter, Ashley already seated with a mimosa in one hand and her phone in the other. She didn't look up when I approached. Daniel kissed my cheek lightly and said, "You look great, Mom." It wasn't until I sat down that I noticed the air, the way Ashley's tone shifted whenever she addressed me, bright, too bright, like a customer service smile stretched too far. I tried not to mind. Families get complicated with time. I sipped water and waited for the warmth to settle back in. The rest of the guests trickled in slowly. A couple of Ashley's friends, a cousin I barely recognized, even her old yoga instructor. But no one from our side of the family. I asked Daniel quietly, "Is Emma coming?" My granddaughter, now 17, with a quick wit and a gentle heart. He frowned. "Ah, she had a school thing." I nodded, pretending not to feel the sting. The meal passed with forced laughter, Ashley holding court like a talk show host. She spoke about their upcoming renovations, about how hard it had been to find a contractor who understood the vision. Then she dropped it, casual like tossing a coin into a fountain. "We're thinking of finally converting that guest unit behind the main house into an Airbnb," she said. "It's just sitting there, and we figured since it's not really being used." I froze. My fork hovered midair. Daniel chimed in quickly. "Yeah, it's a smart move. Passive income, you know." I set the fork down gently. "You mean my unit?" Ashley tilted her head, smile tight. "Well, technically it's part of the main property, isn't it?" I said nothing, just folded my napkin over my lap and turned toward Daniel. He wouldn't meet my eyes. "I paid for that build-out," I said softly, "with your father's life insurance." Daniel leaned in, smiling the way people do when they want to minimize a conflict. "It's just an idea, Mom. No need to overreact." I wanted to stand up. I wanted to scream. Instead, I smiled too. It was my quietest armor. When the waiter brought dessert, Ashley ordered something vegan and photographed it before touching it. The candle in my small chocolate cake flickered as if unsure it was welcome. Daniel stood up halfway through coffee. He tapped his glass gently, calling for attention. "We just want to say thank you," he began, "to everyone who came out today, and especially to my mom, for everything she's done. We wouldn't be where we are without her." I felt something soften inside me. Then he added, "And we're so excited to finally start fresh as a family. A nuclear family. Just us and the baby on the way." There was silence. A few murmurs. Someone clapped. Ashley beamed. I looked around, confused. "The baby?" Ashley's hand went to her belly instinctively. 6 weeks, she said. "We were waiting to tell you." I should have felt joy. Instead, I felt removed from my own body, like I was watching someone else's moment. It wasn't the pregnancy. It was what came after. Daniel turned toward me, voice louder now to overcome the awkwardness. "And this next chapter," he said, "it means creating space, setting boundaries, and sometimes that means not holding on to things from the past, even when it's hard." Ashley added quickly, "You've been a great help, Linda, really. But we all need room to grow." Then came the words, so fast I almost missed them. "Stay out of my life," Daniel said. "Let us do this our way." The room didn't gasp. There was no audible reaction, just the clink of a fork hitting a plate, someone shifting in their seat. I stared at my son. The same boy who once cried because he lost a spelling bee. The same boy I held through fevers, who had night terrors until he was 11. The boy who couldn't ride a bike until 12, but made me promise not to tell anyone. I looked at him and saw none of that. Now, just a man with polished shoes and a mouth that moved without flinching. I stood up slowly, adjusted the sleeve of my blouse, took a final sip of water. Then I turned and left the restaurant without saying another word. Outside, the wind had picked up, The cold wrapped around me like a warning. My heels clicked against the sidewalk like punctuation marks I didn't want to place. I didn't cry. I walked 3 blocks in silence, past flower shops and commuters, and a man playing saxophone for no one in particular. I felt invisible, but I also felt free. When I reached the corner of 5th and Monroe, I stopped at a bus bench and sat. My fingers brushed over the gold bracelet on my wrist. I remembered the day Daniel gave it to me. He was broke, exhausted, and newly licensed. "It's not much," he'd said, "but I wanted you to have something permanent." He was right. It was permanent, and now it burned against my skin. I didn't go home that night. There was nothing waiting there except echoes and framed photographs I no longer trusted. Instead, I checked into the Halston Inn, a modest little hotel near the train station. It smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and aging carpet. The clerk at the front desk didn't ask questions. I paid in full for 3 nights, declined housekeeping, and asked for a room facing away from the street. Once inside, I removed the gold bracelet, laid it gently on the desk, and stared at it like it might speak. It didn't. I thought I might cry, but grief didn't rise. What came instead was clarity, cold and precise. I boiled water with the electric kettle, made a cup of stale chamomile tea, and sat on the edge of the bed with a legal pad in my lap. For the first time in years, I wrote my name, not as Mom, not as Grandma, but as Linda Margaret Wallace, a name I hadn't said out loud in too long. Then I wrote a second name, Daniel Aaron Wallace. I drew a line between us, and under it, I began to list every dollar, every asset, every favor I'd quietly handed over across the last decade. By midnight, I had 8 full pages. The house behind their main property? I'd funded the construction. I had receipts somewhere. The hybrid SUV Ashley drove, registered in my name. The education fund for Emma and Ethan, built with dividends from my investments. Even Daniel's law school tuition, $73,000 after his scholarship fell through. I remembered the exact number. I'd paid it from the life insurance after my husband died. I went to bed with that number humming in my mind. The next morning, I returned home. The key clicked, as usual, but the house felt colder. I walked past the entryway mirror, caught my own reflection, and barely recognized the woman staring back. Not because I looked different, but because for the first time in decades, I wasn't holding myself small. I walked into my bedroom and opened the cedar chest at the foot of the bed. Inside, tucked between quilted blankets and an envelope of my husband's letters, was a red accordion folder. I pulled it out. Inside were copies of financial documents, notarized letters, property records. I'd kept them out of habit, unsure why. Now I understood. I spread them across my bed like puzzle pieces. Dates, signatures, transfers. I made a new list, this time sorted by legal relevance. When the clock hit noon, I called Margaret Lane. She had been my estate attorney for nearly 15 years, though I hadn't spoken to her since she helped draft my will after Richard died. She picked up on the 3rd ring. "Linda," she said, surprised, "it's been a while. I need to schedule something in person," I said. "This week if you can." Her voice changed instantly. "Is everything all right?" "No," I said plainly, "but it will be." At the firm's office 2 days later, I handed her a manila envelope thick with documentation. Margaret wore reading glasses with thin red frames and had a soft but relentless way of flipping through paperwork like she was unraveling a mystery. As she reviewed each page, her brow tightened. "Linda," she said eventually, "do you have any idea how much financial leverage you've given your son?" I nodded. "I do now." She tapped a sheet. "This car title, if it's in your name, you could reclaim it any time." "Yes," I said, "they think it's theirs." "Your name is also on the utility shed conversion behind the property, registered under a dual-use clause. If you wanted to, you could file to reclassify the structure." "I want to." Margaret paused, reading me. "You're not just angry." "No," I said, "I'm awake." She didn't argue. We worked for hours, revising my will, drafting revocation letters, preparing title transfer holds. I signed slowly, deliberately, as if rewriting history with each pen stroke. By dusk, I had a folder full of control. On the way home, I stopped at the grocery store. I bought apples, good cheese, a bottle of red wine, and a single lemon cake. The clerk didn't ask if I needed a bag. She packed everything quietly and handed it to me with a nod. It felt good to be seen, not as someone's mother or helper, but as a person. Back home, I poured a glass of wine and sat at my dining table. The silence wasn't heavy. It was clean, uncluttered. I thought about Daniel's face as he said those words, "Stay out of my life." I could still hear the way his voice had trembled at the end, like he wasn't sure if he meant it, but now I no longer needed to guess. I thought about all the times I stayed quiet to keep the peace, about every unasked question, every unchallenged insult, every inch I'd given while pretending I wasn't shrinking. And I thought about the bracelet. It sat on the table beside my glass, catching the amber light. It still fit, of course, but I finally understood it wasn't a symbol of connection anymore. It was a receipt. The morning after I signed the last set of legal documents, I woke before sunrise. It had rained lightly overnight. The air outside was thick with that post-rain hush that makes the world feel more honest. I opened the front window and let the scent of damp earth fill the room. There was still much to do. I made tea instead of coffee. My hands, steady now, moved through the ritual with a calm I hadn't felt in years. Steeping, pouring, sitting, I stared at the legal envelope on the kitchen counter, the one Margaret had handed back with a paperclip binding the new will, title updates and revocation notices. The truth is, I hadn't told anyone yet. Not even Emma, my granddaughter, though part of me wanted to. She was the only one who had ever asked, years ago, "Grandma, what do you really want? Not just for us, but for you." I hadn't had an answer then. I was too busy smoothing paths for others. Now I had one. I spent the rest of the morning logging into my financial accounts, confirming ownerships, changing passwords, removing Daniel as a secondary contact on everything from utilities to life insurance. There was a time I had given him access to spare him the burden if anything happened to me. Now I understood the burden had never been mine to carry. By noon, I'd packed a bag, not out of fear, but strategy. It held essentials: the revised will, birth certificate, power of attorney documents, a flash drive of scanned receipts and bank records, and a single photo of Richard and me taken before Daniel was born, when we still thought love was enough to hold the future in place. Then I did something small, but significant. I walked into the back bedroom, the one I had turned into my craft space after retirement, and opened the bottom drawer of the cedar cabinet. Inside was a ring of old keys. They jingled softly, small metal echoes of forgotten doors. I found the one I was looking for. Brass, long-necked, still labeled in my handwriting with faded pen ink, storage 512, Belmont. 12 years ago, I'd rented that unit when we downsized after Richard's passing. I was supposed to empty it a year later, but life got away from me, and I kept paying the monthly fee like it was an apology for not being ready. It was time. The storage facility sat on the edge of town, behind a row of repair shops and a crumbling billboard that once advertised a frozen yogurt chain that had long since gone under. The manager was new, but friendly. He took my ID, handed me a clipboard, and pointed to the gate. "You're good to go, Miss Wallace, still active." I drove in slow. Unit 512 was wedged between a vintage motorcycle mechanic's cluttered container and an unused unit that smelled faintly of mothballs and paint thinner. The lock opened on the first try. The air inside was still and heavy with memory. Stacks of labeled boxes greeted me like a time capsule. Daniel's college binders, Christmas china, Richard's tools, Emma's art from grade school. I stood there for a moment, letting the dust settle around my ankles. Then I bent down and began to search. Half an hour later, I found it, a clear plastic bin labeled Legal House and Loan Records. Inside was everything I'd hoped still existed: contracts from Daniel's student loans, copies of property agreements from the guest house build-out, and a check stub dated July 8, 2014, $18,000 paid directly to a contractor for Ashley's studio renovation, signed by me. There it was, proof that their foundation stood on ground I'd paved. I took only what I needed and left the rest intact. No vengeance, no destruction, just reclamation. On the drive home, my phone buzzed twice, missed calls, Daniel. I didn't answer. Not out of cruelty, but because he had used up the privilege of my immediate availability. For once, he could wait. That evening, I sat in the living room as twilight sank through the windows. I spread the documents across the coffee table, categorizing them by action. Retain, reclaim, revoke. I was creating not just a paper trail, but a boundary. That was when I heard it. The front gate. It has a specific sound, the latch against the iron post. I froze. A moment later, the front door handle turned slightly, then clicked, locked. Then the knock. I didn't move. The second knock was louder, I rose, not afraid, but alert. I walked to the door, peeked through the peephole. Daniel. I waited. He knocked again. Mom, please, can we just talk? I opened the door 3 inches, enough to see his face, but not enough for him to step inside. His eyes were tired, he hadn't shaved. Hi, he said. I didn't reply. Look, he continued, Ashley's freaking out. She thinks you're retaliating. Did you freeze the investment account? Yes, I said. He blinked. Okay, why? Why? I met his gaze. Because it was in my name. It always was. He ran a hand through his hair. You're upset. I get that. But we're family. I interrupted. You said you wanted me out of your life. He opened his mouth, but no words came. I'm just following instructions. He stepped back slightly, as if struck. Mom, he said finally, this isn't what I meant. No, I said, but it's what you said, and now I believe you. I closed the door gently and locked it. Then I sat back down, picked up my pen, and wrote a new line at the bottom of the revoke column. Emotional access, no longer granted. The door clicked softly behind me. Not a slam, not a shout, just the sound of finality. It was strange, how little noise it took to end something that had once been the center of my universe. I stood still for a long moment, my hand on the brass lock, waiting for a feeling that didn't come. No surge of guilt, no second thoughts, just quiet. The kind of quiet that had weight. I returned to the living room, where the papers still lay in careful rows. I didn't sit this time. I stood and began sorting everything into folders. I wasn't angry, not in the loud fire and ash kind of way. I was something slower, something solid. I was done being underestimated. I slipped the newly labeled folders into a fireproof case I kept under the coat closet. My lawyer had called it an excellent layer of protection, but what it truly offered me was clarity. These papers weren't revenge, they were insurance, boundaries written in ink. By evening, I had finished filing. I cleaned the kitchen, washed every dish, not because they were dirty, but because I needed my hands to be moving. My body still hadn't caught up to my new reality, that Daniel was no longer a son I could call mine, not in the emotional sense. Biologically, yes, but family is earned in how we protect each other, and he had stopped doing that a long time ago. I lit one candle on the dining table, not for ambience but for memory. Richard used to do that when the house felt too still. He believed in small comforts when larger ones failed. The flicker of flame cast soft gold onto the walls, reflecting off my bracelet as I reached to adjust the wick. That bracelet used to symbolize hope. Now it was a reminder. A receipt, yes, but also a boundary line I had redrawn around myself. My phone buzzed again. Another message from Daniel. Can we talk? Please. Not about the money, about us. I read it twice, then deleted it. Talking had become a language he only used when cornered. I had no interest in playing translator. Instead, I opened the drawer where I kept my old journals. They were plain black notebooks, filled mostly with grocery lists, to-do items, small memories I never wanted to lose. I flipped to a blank page and wrote something I hadn't dared admit before. He raised his voice because he thought I'd always come back. I didn't cry. The next morning, I went to the courthouse. It was a tan building, with too much glass, humming with the quiet anxiety of people trying to prove things: innocence, identity, ownership. I waited in line behind a woman arguing about a property lien and an elderly couple filing a marriage license. When my turn came, I submitted paperwork to update the deed classification on the guest house and remove Daniel's name from 3 joint forms he'd never earned the right to hold. The clerk didn't blink, just stamped each page and slid it back into a manila envelope. It felt oddly mechanical, like clearing out a basement you didn't know had been flooded. When I walked out into the sun, I felt taller, not lighter. There's nothing light about grief that comes from choosing self-respect, but stronger. Back home, I made soup, lentils, garlic, and thyme, the kind I used to make for Daniel when he was sick. He'd slurp it down too fast and burn his tongue, then pout until I brought him milk. It's strange, the memories that surface when you stop fighting them. The doorbell rang mid-stir. I turned off the burner and waited. Then it rang again, short, urgent. Through the peephole, I saw a woman. Ashley. I opened the door only slightly. Her mascara was too heavy for the hour. Her lips were pressed into a tight line. Can I come in? She asked. I didn't respond. She exhaled like she'd been holding something in too long. Look, I know things have gotten tense. That was her word for it. Tense. She continued. But Daniel's unraveling. He's not eating. He barely sleeps. He said you cut off the car registration, the insurance access, everything. I did, I said plainly. Her eyes widened a bit. Okay. But why now? Why like this? I studied her face. The polish was there, as always, but beneath it, fear. Not of me, but of losing the illusion of control. I did it, I said, because I finally believed what he told me. Which was that he didn't want me in his life. Ashley looked down at her hands. Her nails were chipped, an unusual detail for her. I never wanted it to be like this, she said. But you benefited from it, I replied. From every dollar, every hour, every ride, every check. You never stopped him. That makes you part of it. She swallowed. Her throat moved like it hurt. I just wanted a family, she whispered. I almost believed her. Then I remembered the brunch, the performative kindness, the announcement that treated my home like a dowry they were entitled to. You had one, I said, but it came with responsibility, and you treated me like a spare part. Ashley looked up. Will you at least tell him goodbye? No, I said, because this isn't a goodbye, it's a boundary. I closed the door before she could speak again. Later that night, I took a walk. Just around the block. Nothing dramatic. The sky was bruised with twilight. Trees lined the street like sentinels from another time. I passed neighbors I hadn't spoken to in months. We nodded. The world continued turning, as it always does, even when your internal orbit collapses. I returned home and made a cup of mint tea. No sugar, just hot water and leaves. As I settled into the armchair by the front window, I watched the street grow quiet. I didn't expect an apology. I didn't crave reconciliation. What I wanted, finally wholly, was my life back. Not the one I'd given to others, not the one edited for company, but mine. The one with music that I liked, with soup that burned gently, with silence that didn't feel like punishment. And for the first time, I didn't wait for anyone to join me. 3 days passed without a word. No texts, no calls, no knocks at the door. It was the kind of silence that used to frighten me when I still mistook absence for abandonment. Now it felt like space, like clean air after a storm. I began to reclaim my routines, one by one. I rearranged the kitchen drawers, moved the spatulas to where they made more sense, labeled the herbs in my spice rack the way I liked them, bold black print, lined up by frequency. I bought a new journal, thicker than the last, and wrote in it every morning, just after the sun touched the far wall of my living room. Each entry began the same. What I own, I now protect. It wasn't about things. It was about the life I had built piece by piece, after decades of reducing myself for the sake of harmony. I'd confused silence with peace for too long. That morning, I received an envelope in the mail. Handwritten, no return address. I knew the handwriting before I opened it. Daniel's was always slightly crooked, as if rushing ahead of his own thoughts. He used to write thank you notes with the same penmanship, back when gratitude came naturally. Inside was a letter. Brief. Mom, I don't know what to say, except that I never imagined it would come to this. I was stupid, selfish. I let the lines blur until they disappeared entirely. You were never just help, never background. You were the reason we ever had a beginning. I won't ask for anything else. I don't deserve to. But if you ever want to talk, not to fix things, just to be heard, I'm here. Daniel. I folded the letter and placed it in the drawer with my tea towels. Not to forget it, not to forgive it, but to remind myself that remorse is not the same as repair. I didn't write back. The following week, I visited the library, not to check out books, I had plenty of those, but to donate a set of educational puzzles and children's readers I had stored in the closet. Emma had outgrown them years ago, but I'd kept them in case Ashley ever softened, in case I was invited back into the small, messy beauty of my grandchildren's everyday lives. But some doors, once closed, don't require reopening. At the library, a volunteer named Candace, a woman about my age with copper curls and orthopedic shoes, thanked me for the donation. We spoke about reading levels and learning gaps. I told her I used to teach early literacy in the 19. Would you ever consider coming in to help with our family literacy nights? She asked. I hesitated for a breath, then said, yes, not because I was lonely, but because I remembered who I was before motherhood consumed me entirely. On Thursday, I taught my first class. 3 children, 2 fathers, 1 grandmother, with a quiet boy who wouldn't lift his eyes until I asked him if he liked cats. His smile, when it came, felt like sunlight through stained glass. Afterward, Candace handed me a clipboard with next month's schedule. "You're a natural," she said. I nodded, unable to speak around the sudden warmth pressing at my throat. That evening, back home, I pulled the old photo albums from the hall closet, not to dwell, but to sort. I placed sticky notes on the backs of prints I wanted Emma to have someday. One of her riding a carousel at 6 years old, her hands raised, fearless. One of me and Richard on our 10th anniversary, his hand on mine, both of us squinting in the sun. In the bottom of the album, I found a photo I hadn't seen in years. Daniel, age 9, holding a model rocket he had built for the science fair. He'd painted it red and gold and cried when the wind knocked it over before launch. I almost tucked the photo into the discard pile. But something in his expression held me. Not the pride, but the hope. The fragile, trembling kind that hadn't learned yet how to disappoint. I put the photo in an envelope and slid it into the back of the drawer, beside the bracelet box I never wore anymore. Some things didn't need to be displayed, but they deserved to be kept. 2 nights later, I got a call from Emma. Her voice was smaller than I remembered, less sharp around the edges. "Hi, Grandma," she said. "I heard about everything. I just wanted you to know. I never agreed with what happened." I exhaled slowly. "You don't have to explain anything, sweetheart." "I do," she insisted. "Because Dad says you cut him off. And maybe you did, but that doesn't mean I don't want you in my life." Tears pricked behind my eyes, not the sad kind, the kind that come when something true finally breaks through a silence that's lasted too long. "I'll always be here," I said, "but only if it's a door you want to open, not one I push through." There was a pause. Then, "I do want it." I never stopped. We didn't talk for long, just enough to name the distance and agree to shorten it. When I hung up, I smiled into the empty room. A real smile, not the kind you wear to make others comfortable. And for the first time, I allowed myself the smallest hope that healing doesn't always need to look like reunion. Sometimes it looks like quiet acknowledgement, like an honest phone call from a girl who still sees you as more than the conflict she grew up watching. Later that night, I opened the windows wide. The breeze carried in the smell of jasmine and fresh grass clippings. I stood there, arms folded gently, watching the neighborhood settle into sleep. And I knew, deep in my chest, that I had already begun my own kind of rebuilding. Not with wood or drywall, but with resolve, with memory, with space reclaimed. There would be more letters, more silences, maybe even more attempts at reconciliation. But I would answer none of them from obligation, only from truth. Saturday mornings used to be when I'd drive over to Daniel's. I'd bring muffins from the corner bakery, the kind Emma liked, cranberry orange, and sit at their kitchen table while Ashley fluttered around pretending not to watch the clock. I'd stay just long enough to load the dishwasher, fold a basket of laundry, and remind myself that presence counted more than warmth. Now Saturdays were mine again. I woke to birdsong instead of obligation. I dressed slowly, smoothing the sleeves of my silk blouse with deliberate hands. My gold bracelet slid quietly into place. I no longer wore it for nostalgia. I wore it to remember the value of what I gave and the dignity I reclaimed. I spent the morning pruning the lavender outside my front porch. The plant had grown unruly, bursting over the edges of the brick planter like it had forgotten how to stay small. I liked that about it now. I didn't shape it too harshly, just trimmed enough to let it breathe. Around 10, I went inside to brew a pot of Earl Grey. I poured it into the china cup I used to save for company. I'd realized, finally, that I was worth the good dishes. I brought the tea out to the porch and sat in my weathered chair, the one Richard built the year we moved into the house. The sky was clear, the air cool enough to make the warmth of the mug feel like an embrace. A young woman passed by on the sidewalk with a stroller. She waved. I waved back. No expectations, no performance. Just a neighbor seeing another neighbor. It felt revolutionary. By midday, I decided to visit the storage unit again. There were still boxes I hadn't touched. Old receipts, forgotten furniture, a cedar chest of Richard's that I hadn't had the courage to open since he passed. The drive was quiet, the roads familiar, but softer now, like the grief had finally sanded down the edges. When I arrived, I unlocked the unit and stepped inside. Dust floated in the sunlight like ash from a fire long extinguished. I found the cedar chest in the back corner, It was heavier than I remembered, but I managed to slide it forward and lift the lid. Inside were things I'd forgotten I'd saved. Richard's cufflinks, a Father's Day card from Daniel, drawn in crayon and spelling his name backward, a silk scarf from our honeymoon in Montreal. One corner was torn, but I pressed it gently between my palms, remembering how we'd gotten caught in the rain walking back to the hotel. He wrapped it around my head, laughing, saying I looked like a movie star. At the bottom of the chest, wrapped in brown paper, was the ledger. I had forgotten all about it. It was a red, cloth-bound notebook where I'd tracked every loan, every gift, every IOU that Daniel had sworn he'd repay. It wasn't about the money. It never had been. But seeing it all in one place, the down payments, the emergency bailouts, the quiet transfers from my retirement fund when he said he just needed a boost, made something click in my spine. Not anger, just confirmation. I carried the ledger with me back to the car, placed it on the passenger seat like a witness to a trial only I could attend. That evening, I went through the pages again. Itemized, meticulous. Even the smallest favors, baby clothes, surprise grocery deliveries, repairs I paid for discreetly so they wouldn't feel embarrassed, had been logged in careful handwriting. I had stopped recording them a few years ago, not because they ended, but because I stopped believing I'd ever get anything back. Now, I didn't want it back. I just wanted it acknowledged. I made copies of the ledger, one digital, one printed and placed in the fireproof safe beside my will. I didn't do it as a threat. I did it to make the invisible visible to myself, if no one else. Later, as the light dimmed, I wrote a letter to Emma. Not to send now, but someday. You were the reason I stayed longer than I should have. You were the light I followed when everything else went dark. I don't know what role I'll play in your future, but if you ever wonder whether you were loved, know that you were fully, fiercely, quietly, in the background, the way women like me were taught to love. But I'm learning that love doesn't have to mean disappearing. It can mean showing up for yourself too. I folded the letter and placed it between 2 pages in my journal. That night, after dinner, I sat in the quiet again. No TV, no music, just the creak of the floorboards and the soft tap of the wind against the window panes. I lit a single candle and watched the flame move. Then I stood, walked to the mirror in the hallway, and looked at myself. The bun was still tight, the blouse still smooth, but the woman in the reflection had changed. Not in her face, though the lines had deepened, but in her gaze. It no longer asked to be chosen. It no longer softened to make others feel strong. It simply met its own eyes and held. I didn't open the door right away when the knock came. It was Monday afternoon, and I had just returned from the community center, where I'd begun helping Candace prep materials for the upcoming literacy night. We'd spent 2 hours sorting picture books and spelling tiles, the kind that stuck together with magnets and could never quite be placed crookedly. I liked that about them, how the letters snapped into alignment when held close enough. Now, someone was at my door. The knock was firm, but not aggressive. I set down my canvas tote, took a slow breath, and approached. Through the peephole, I saw a woman I didn't recognize. Late 30s, maybe early 40s, brown trench coat, tired eyes, hands folded around a worn leather folder. Her presence had the texture of someone sent, not someone coming by choice. I opened the door halfway. Yes? Her voice was soft, practiced. Mrs. Wallace? I nodded. My name's Laura Grant. I work with the firm that manages your son's business assets. She held out a card I didn't take. I'm here on Daniel's behalf. Of course she was. I'm not in the habit of receiving emissaries, I said. If your client has something to say, he knows how to use a phone. I understand, she said quickly. I'm not here to press anything. He just asked me to deliver some documents and to say, she hesitated, that there's no expectation attached. I studied her face. No agenda, just the worn patience of someone who delivered too many messages to too many houses that didn't want them. I opened the door just enough for her to hand over the folder. It was plain, olive green, the kind with metal clasps. Good day, Miss Grant. She gave a small nod. Take care, Mrs. Wallace. I closed the door and locked it. Only then did I take the folder to the dining table, set it down, and pour myself a glass of water. I let it sit for a full 5 minutes before I opened it. Inside were receipts, wire transfers, a summary of loan repayments made over the last decade, totaling less than 1/3 of what had been borrowed, though it was more than I expected. At the bottom was a letter, typed. I can't undo what I took for granted. but I can stop pretending I never owed it. This doesn't fix us, I know that. But it's the first time I'm not asking you to fix anything for me. Whatever else happens, you gave more than anyone ever has. I'm sorry I only learned to count it after it was gone. No signature, no salutation, just paper and ink. I closed the folder and placed it inside the drawer with the ledger. I didn't need to respond. Not everything needed a conclusion. Some debts weren't about repayment, they were about recognition. And he had done that, finally, in the only way he knew how, not with apology, but with quiet proof. The next morning, I took the long way to the grocery store. I passed the park where Emma used to feed the ducks. A new bench had been installed near the pond. I stopped and sat down for a few minutes, watching two toddlers chase pigeons while their father tried, unsuccessfully, to keep them from running into the mud. It struck me how much energy it took to hold something together. Families, expectations, illusions. But letting go had its own kind of momentum. Once I stopped holding everything, my own hands felt lighter. At the store, I picked up rosemary bread, fresh figs, and a wedge of aged cheddar. I also bought a tiny lemon tart, just one. Back home, I sliced the bread, plated the cheese, and poured a glass of white wine. I sat in the sunlit nook by the kitchen window and let myself savor the food slowly. There had been times I scarfed down meals over the sink, too tired to sit, afraid to let silence settle. Now I welcomed it. There was a sacredness to quiet that I hadn't understood until it became a choice. That afternoon, I received an email from the library coordinator. One of the fathers from the family reading night had written in to say thank you. His daughter had struggled with reading for 2 years, but after our session together, she'd asked him to take her to the bookstore. She wanted a chapter book. She picked the one with the girl who has a secret power, the email said. I told her maybe hers was bravery. I closed the email and smiled. Some things take root in unexpected places. That evening, I sat at my desk and began to rewrite my legacy letter. The one I'd tucked behind my will years ago, meant to be read by my family after I passed. I pulled out the old one. It was full of apologies. Apologies for boundaries, for miscommunications, for not loving loudly enough. I shredded it. In its place, I wrote, "To whoever reads this when I am gone, you don't owe me grief. But if you think of me, I hope it's in a quiet moment when the world feels still and you're not performing for anyone. I hope you remember I was a woman who tried, who gave more than she had, and who eventually remembered she didn't have to disappear to be loved. And if you feel far from grace or dignity, know this: it is never too late to return to yourself." After sunset, I lit the candle on the kitchen table. I didn't need it for light. I needed it for presence. The flame reflected off the edge of my wine glass and the gold of my bracelet. I looked down at my hands, steady now, and thought, this was mine. This house, this silence, this reclaimed life, all mine. And I wasn't giving it away again. A week later, I received a letter, not from Daniel, not from Emma, but from the county housing office. I unfolded it slowly, noting the formal seal at the top, the bureaucratic phrasing, the signature line from a woman named Sylvia Harmon. The tone was polite but firm, a request for clarification about the guest house. The letter explained that someone had recently submitted an inquiry about the property's zoning designation. It didn't say who, but I didn't need it to. They were looking for loopholes. I sat with that realization for a while. They weren't asking to reconcile. They weren't even asking to negotiate. They were asking if I had left the door unlocked. I went to the file cabinet, pulled the most recent paperwork from my lawyer, and drafted a response. 3 pages, calm, factual, supported with the scanned documents and notarized updates Margaret had filed weeks earlier. I didn't add emotion. Bureaucracies don't speak that language. By the end of the day, the envelope was sealed, addressed, and walked directly to the post office. No delays. When I handed it to the clerk, I made eye contact as I said, "Certified, with return receipt." He nodded and stamped it with authority. On the walk back, I paused at a florist stand outside the hardware store. It was the same one I'd passed for years without stopping, the same stand where I used to buy peonies in May for Emma's dance recitals. Today, I bought white tulips. I didn't need a reason. At home, I placed them in the crystal vase Richard and I received for our 30th anniversary. It had been in a box until last year, when I finally allowed myself to see it, not as a memory of what was lost, but as a vessel still capable of holding something beautiful. The tulips stood tall in the morning light, clean, unapologetic. That evening, Emma called. She was walking home from her part-time job at a cafe near her university. I could hear the rustle of her backpack, the city in the background, traffic, someone yelling for a bus, the muted chatter of strangers. She told me she'd been accepted into a year-long exchange program in Paris. Art history, full scholarship. "You always told me to follow the thing that makes my hands move without thinking," she said. "I remember," I said. "You used to draw ballerinas in the margins of your math homework." She laughed. "I still do. Except now they're abstract and sometimes missing limbs. You always did know how to make beauty out of imbalance." There was a pause. "Do you think Dad would be proud?" she asked. The question was soft, honest, not a test but a reaching out. "I think he's still learning how," I answered. She didn't argue. She just breathed. "I want to visit before I go," she said. "Just us, no one else needs to know." "I'd like that," I said. I hung up the phone and pressed my palm to my chest. Not because it hurt, but because something there had opened. 2 days later, I cleaned the guest house. Not to surrender it, not to prepare it for Daniel, but because it was mine. The tiny space behind the main house had always been a compromise, a refuge offered in disguise. It had no central air, only a standing fan that buzzed faintly when it turned. The windows were small, the kitchenette modest. Still, it had good bones. I dusted the baseboards, washed the linen curtains, and polished the wooden table by the front window. I left the door open to let in fresh air. The scent of tulips drifted from the main house. At some point, I stopped cleaning and sat on the small love seat, facing the window. From that angle, I could see the full length of the garden path, the tall rosemary bush, and the faded bird bath Richard installed the summer after his second heart scare. It was strange to realize how long I'd lived in proximity to my own story without ever fully stepping into it. For years I'd been told I was a temporary resident in their narrative, helpful, generous, but optional. Now, I was reclaiming my title role. Not to be worshipped, just to be witnessed. I stayed there for almost an hour, letting the afternoon settle around me. No one interrupted, no urgent calls, no footsteps down the path. Only the wind and the occasional chirp of the wren that had taken up residence in the garden wall. Eventually, I stood and closed the windows. I left the guest house door ajar, not because I was waiting for anyone, but because light deserved a way in. That night, I didn't write in my journal. I didn't light a candle. I simply sat in the center of the house I had once shrunk myself inside of, and allowed the silence to sound like belonging. The next part of my life would not be handed over to anyone else. If they wanted access, they would have to knock with respect, not expectation. And I would answer only if I felt safe doing so. Emma arrived late on a Sunday afternoon. She didn't ring the bell. She knocked gently, 3 soft taps, like the memory of a knock, and when I opened the door, she was already half smiling in that uncertain way young people do when they're unsure what world they're walking into. She had her sketchbook tucked under one arm, a scarf looped twice around her neck, even though the air was still warm. I noticed the way her hair had changed, shorter, curled at the edges, grown up, but still hers. "Hi, Grandma." I stepped back and opened the door fully. "Come in, love." We didn't hug at first. We just stood in the threshold of my living room, like 2 people reacquainting themselves with each other's outlines. Then she dropped her bag and reached for me, not urgently, not apologetically, just honestly. Her arms around my shoulders were tighter than I expected. She smelled faintly of eucalyptus and charcoal pencil. I held her for a breath longer than I should have. "I'm glad you came," I whispered into her hair. "Me too," she said. "I needed to see for myself." We spent the next hour in the kitchen. I had prepared finger sandwiches, egg salad, cucumber, and a few leftover slices of roast chicken, and arranged them on the floral china I hadn't used since Olivia's baby shower 5 years ago. Emma poured the tea. She had always liked rituals. Even as a little girl, she insisted on stirring sugar into my cup before I did it myself. "I almost didn't come," she said after the first few bites. I set my cup down. "I wouldn't have blamed you." She shook her head. "No, not because of guilt, because of noise. Everyone's been talking. Dad, Mom, Aunt Lou, they all have a version of you now, and I started wondering if I'd ever get to hear yours." I didn't flinch. "Would you like to?" She looked up. "Only if you want to tell it." So I did. Not as a lecture, not as a list of grievances. Just the truth, as plainly as I could manage it. I told her about the day, Daniel asked me to co-sign the car loan. How I said yes before reading the fine print. About the night I stayed up until 3 cataloging receipts to keep his business afloat when he missed his tax filing. About the brunch, the words, the silence that followed. Emma listened without interruption. No defense, no doubt, just wide eyes and a thumb tracing the rim of her teacup in slow concentric circles. When I finished, I said, "I don't tell you this to make you choose. I tell you so you understand I didn't disappear." I stepped back. "There's a difference." She nodded slowly. "I see that now." And then, more quietly, "I think I always did." After we cleared the dishes, she asked if she could see the guest house. We walked the short path in silence. The sun was lowering in the sky, casting long shadows across the rosemary bushes. When I opened the door to the small space, she inhaled deeply. "I always thought this place was a fairy tale cottage when I was little." "It was supposed to be," I said, "but fairy tales can be rewritten." She wandered inside, running her fingers across the edge of the windowsill, stopping to examine the ceramic lamp I'd placed in the corner. "It feels like you," she said. That made me smile. "That's the highest compliment I've had in years." She sat cross-legged on the love seat. "Do you ever get lonely?" I sat across from her. "Sometimes. But I've learned not to confuse loneliness with emptiness." She tilted her head. "What do you mean?" "I mean that solitude can be full if you fill it with the right things. Honesty, quiet, peace. Loneliness wants to be fixed, but solitude just wants to be noticed." She didn't answer right away. Then she said, "I think I've been lonely at home." I didn't ask for details. She didn't need to explain. Some things are inherited not by blood, but by silence passed down like china, no one ever unwraps. Later, we walked back to the main house. I gave her a box of my old journals, the ones she used to sneak into when she was 10, and draw tiny stars in the margins. "You don't have to read them now," I said. "Just know they're here when you're ready." She hugged me again, tighter this time, less hesitation. "I'm going to Paris," she said as she stepped back. "I leave next month." "I know. I'll send you sketches." "Please do." She looked around the living room, as if trying to memorize it. "I used to think this house belonged to everyone but you," she said. "Now I realize it's always been yours. You just made space for everyone else." I touched her cheek, the way I used to when she'd wake from nightmares. "And now I'm making space for myself." After she left, I didn't cry. I sat in the same chair where she'd just been, picked up her empty teacup, and held it for a moment. It was still warm. There was no tragedy in her leaving. Only a small, quiet triumph. A promise made in tea bags and stories and the space between generations that, if nurtured gently, could become a bridge instead of a wall. The day after Emma's visit, the house felt different. Not emptier, fuller, as though something long buried had finally been acknowledged and exhaled. Her teacup still sat in the sink, and I didn't rush to clean it. Let it rest there a while. Let it remind me that grace had been given and received in a way that needed no performance, no permission. I moved through the house deliberately, watered the herbs, wrote a thank you card to the library staff. Then I took the guest house key from its dish on the entry table and slipped it into my pocket. Something inside me needed closure, something quiet but firm. It had been weeks since Daniel last reached out. No letters, no emails, no intermediaries with folders or statements of regret. But I knew he hadn't let go, not entirely, and I knew somehow that silence from him was not peace, it was waiting. The kind that comes with a motive. At noon, I received a voicemail. It was from a number I didn't recognize, though the voice was unmistakable. Daniel. Clipped. Controlled. "Hi, Mom. I just wanted to let you know I'll be stopping by this afternoon. There are a few things I'd like to talk through. I don't want to argue, I think we need to have a conversation. Please be home." I didn't ask if it was a good time. He didn't ask if I wanted to see him. He informed. And for a moment, just a flicker, I felt the old reflex rise, the sense that I should be ready, composed, agreeable, the way I used to be when he showed up late for dinner or called only when a favor was needed. But I wasn't that woman anymore. I made myself a sandwich, turkey and avocado on wheat, and ate it slowly by the garden window. I cleaned the dish, brushed my hair, retied my bun. Not for him, for me. I wanted to meet this moment not disheveled by emotion, but whole. When the knock came, I was standing in the hallway with the door in view. 3 firm raps. I didn't move immediately. I waited. The knock came again, longer this time, a beat of impatience behind it. I approached, stopping a few feet from the threshold. I could see his silhouette through the frosted glass panel, a figure I once recognized as my child, now blurred by years of estrangement and rewritten roles. "Mom?" he called. "Are you home?" I didn't answer. A pause, then a softer voice. "Please." Another pause. I thought of Emma, of our tea, our laughter, of the gentle way she had said, "I always thought this place belonged to everyone but you." And now, for the first time in a long time, it did belong to me. The walls, the silence, the air, it was mine. "I don't want to leave things like this," Daniel said through the door. "You raised me better than that." I nearly smiled, because he was right. I had raised him with every ounce of compassion I could muster. I taught him not to leave dishes in the sink, not to lie to get what he wanted, not to confuse love with leverage. But lessons are only as strong as the student's willingness to live by them. "I know I messed up," he continued, voice tighter now. "I know Ashley said some things that were cold, but this can't be how it ends." His words were well measured, practiced, and I realized then that he wasn't speaking to me. He was performing for the idea of me, the role of the forgiving mother, the endless well. But I wasn't a well anymore. I was a woman with limits. After a few minutes, the knocking stopped. I stood there as his footsteps retreated down the walkway. I watched his car pull away from the curb. He didn't look back. I thought I might cry, but what came instead was relief. Not the giddy kind, the earned kind, like stepping out of a room where the air had been thin for too long. Later that evening, I pulled out the legal envelope one final time, not to revise anything, but to reread, to remind myself that closure can be quiet. The papers were still in order. The ledger still accounted for. My will still intact. No revocations, no second thoughts. I lit a candle, not for grief this time, but for gratitude. Then I placed the guest house key in a small velvet box, wrapped it in a ribbon, and wrote a note. "This home, and the strength it took to keep it, are mine now. Not because I fought for them, but because I finally stopped offering them away." I locked the box and placed it in the back of my closet, not out of reach, but out of sight. I didn't need it to be visible anymore. Its truth was already inside me. That night, I stepped onto the back porch. The garden was still. The air smelled faintly of lavender and rain on concrete. I stood under the porch light in my silk blouse, gold bracelet catching the glow, and closed my eyes. There was nothing left to chase. And I was no longer standing on anyone else's welcome mat. The next morning, the sky opened with a soft drizzle, just enough rain to streak the window panes and draw up the scent of damp soil. I stood in the kitchen, cradling my first cup of tea, listening to the low murmur of water against the shingles. It was the kind of day I used to call a pause day. Nothing urgent, nothing required. A day that asked you to be still. The house was silent, but not hollow. I moved slowly, letting the rhythm of the rain guide me. Tea, toast, a single drawer straightened, a stack of receipts shredded. I wasn't rushing toward anything anymore. By mid-morning, I found myself standing before the guest house door again. I didn't need to be there, but something pulled me. Inside, it still smelled faintly of citrus cleaner and cedarwood. The love seat by the window was undisturbed, the small bookshelf untouched since I'd added a few volumes last week, poetry mostly, and a gardening guide I hadn't opened since Richard passed. I sat on the edge of the cushion and looked around, wondering if it was time to give this space a future beyond memory. Emma's visit had shifted something in me, not just because she had listened, but because she had asked nothing of me but my truth. It made me wonder who else out there was still living as an afterthought in someone else's story. By lunchtime, I had made a decision. I called the community center. Candace picked up on the second ring. "Linda Wallace," she greeted warmly. "You coming in today?" "Not today," I said, "but I have an idea I'd like to run by you." "Oh?" I could hear the smile in her voice. "Do tell." "I have a detached space on my property. Private, clean, well lit. I was wondering if the center ever needed overflow space, maybe for small group sessions or one-on-one literacy tutoring. Some of the women you mentioned last month, those with small children or who don't like coming downtown. I could host something quieter." There was a beat of silence. Then Linda, "Are you serious?" "Yes." "Do you know how many people avoid our main center because they're ashamed? They think it's a place for failures. But your home, your garden, your porch, it's lived in, gentle, that changes things." "I'm not offering it as a shelter," I said, "just a haven. A few hours a week, that's all. Candace didn't hesitate. We'll work out the logistics. Let's start with one group. Tuesday afternoons? Tuesday it is. That evening, I began rearranging the space. I moved the bookshelf near the window, replaced the old love seat with a sturdier armchair from the attic, and laid a patterned rug over the cold tile floor. I pulled out my basket of extra notepads, sharpened pencils, and alphabet flashcards. By the time the light dimmed, the guest house no longer looked like a place where someone used to live. It looked like a place someone might begin again. The next Tuesday, the first student arrived. Her name was Flora, late 30s, nervous. She came with her son Matteo, a boy of 6, who clung to her coat and wouldn't meet my eyes. I offered tea. She declined. I asked if she preferred to start with reading or writing. She shrugged. So we sat together on the floor with picture books, and she pointed at a word, window, as if unsure whether it was a real thing or a trick. Matteo sat beside her and whispered the word first. She repeated it after him, carefully, like a question. By the end of the session, she had read an entire page aloud. When she left, she took one of the notepads home. Each week, someone new came. A retired bus driver who never learned cursive. A grandmother who wanted to read bedtime stories to her twin grandsons. A teen mother who needed to fill out government forms without guessing. The guest house became more than a structure. It became a kind of reclamation, brick by brick, vowel by vowel. Emma wrote postcards from Paris. They were brief but luminous. Saw a Monet that reminded me of your garden. A woman at a sidewalk cafe looked like you, elegant but dangerous. I sketched the saying today, wish you were here, but also, you are. I pinned them to the corkboard in the kitchen. No need for framed pictures anymore. The words were enough. One Friday afternoon, as I was closing the gate after a student session, I spotted Daniel's car 2 houses down. He didn't get out. Just sat there, hands on the wheel, watching. For a moment, I expected him to approach, but he didn't. He waited 5 minutes, then drove off. I didn't wave. I didn't frown. I simply returned to the guest house, turned off the lights, and locked the door. Whatever he wanted to see, I had already stopped performing for it. That night, I walked the garden path by moonlight. The rosemary bushes brushed my ankles. The night air was crisp. The house glowed behind me. The guest house stood calm in the distance. For the first time, I didn't feel like a woman guarding what she had left. I felt like a woman creating something new. The last of the autumn leaves had fallen by the time Candace brought it up. We were sitting beneath the pergola, outside the community center, sipping tea from mismatched mugs while the Tuesday session wrapped up inside. The air was crisp enough to require a sweater, but still warm enough to sit in the sun if you didn't mind the chill on your hands. You ever think about talking to him again? She asked quietly, eyes not on me, but on a squirrel darting across the path. I didn't answer right away. Candace had become more than a colleague. She was a woman who'd grown into my days slowly, like ivy, comforting, strong, rooted, but she also had a habit of aiming straight for the softest part of a conversation when she thought the moment could hold it. He was parked down the block again last week, she added, saw his face in the mirror when I turned out of your street. I stirred my tea slowly, the spoon clinking gently against the ceramic. I don't keep him out, I said. I just stopped leaving the door open. She nodded as if she'd known that answer all along. Sometimes silence is the most generous boundary we can offer. Later that evening, I walked the garden alone. It had become a ritual I didn't need to schedule anymore, just something my body asked for at the close of each day. There was peace in watching the moon settle into the branches, in hearing the soil quiet itself for the night. I paused beside the rosemary bush, the same one that had grown wild every spring, no matter how tightly I trimmed it. My hands traced the stalks, and I thought of the lives that had passed through here in just a few short weeks. Flora with her trembling hands, Matteo with his timid voice, Jerome who had once driven a city bus but could barely read the signs on his route. This garden had listened to their stories, and now it listened to mine in return. The next day, a letter arrived. It wasn't handwritten, it wasn't typed either. It was a printed flyer, mass-mailed, probably sent to the entire neighborhood, but my name was printed in small font at the bottom. Hosted by Ashley Wallace, it read, Family Finance Seminar, Empowering Generations with Legacy Planning. A photo of Ashley in a blazer, smiling beneath a graphic that said, Secure their future, control your narrative. I stared at it for a long time. Not because I was surprised, but because it finally made sense. They weren't seeking reconciliation. They were seeking redemption, public, polished, and conveniently distant from the truth. Legacy, narrative. Words that had been ripped from the walls of this home and plastered on a flyer like wallpaper to cover a crack. For a moment, I felt the old ache rise again, the part of me that still wanted to be acknowledged, even now. But then I looked around. At the guest house, which now hosted not just lessons, but lives being rebuilt. At the tulips blooming, against season and reason. At my own hands, worn but steady. And I said aloud, to no one in particular, my legacy's already here. That weekend, I met Emma for lunch at a small cafe near the train station. She had returned from Paris a week earlier, cheeks a little more wind-chapped, hair tucked beneath a knit cap. She slid into the booth across from me and grinned. "I brought you something," she said, pulling a narrow package from her coat. It was wrapped in brown paper, tied with twine. Inside was a hand-bound book, rough paper, blank pages. The cover was etched with ink and thread, a drawing of my house, seen from the back garden. The guest house stood quiet in the corner, light spilling from the windows. She had drawn it from memory. "There's only one copy," she said, "for your next chapter." I ran my fingers over the stitching. "I didn't know you noticed that corner of the house so closely." "I notice everything you think people ignore," she said softly. That night, I opened the first page of the book and began to write. Not a ledger, not a letter, just a beginning. I was never meant to be the footnote in someone else's story. I was the binding, the spine, the pages no one bothered to number. I was sitting at the table, pen in hand, when I heard footsteps on the gravel path. Slow, hesitant. I moved to the window and saw Daniel standing at the gate. He wasn't holding papers, he didn't have a folder, he had both hands in his coat pockets and a look that wasn't quite sorrow but close. He didn't try the gate, he just stood there. I didn't move. Not because I was afraid, but because I wanted to see what he would do without being seen. He stayed a minute. 2. Then he turned and walked away. Not angrily, not defeated. Just walked. And I knew then that some chapters don't end with apologies. They end with a pause. And that's enough. I returned to my chair, opened the journal, and wrote one more line. They may never come back with the right words, but I left the silence better than they left the noise. Winter came in softly that year. Not with the crashing kind of cold that empties streets and silences windows, but with a steady hush, frost that arrived like punctuation, mornings that lingered longer before becoming day. I felt it in the slow stretch of the wooden floorboards and the quiet surrender of the lavender stalks beneath their weight of white. There was no more knocking, no more letters, no more apologies packaged in potential, just stillness. And for the first time in my life, it felt earned. Emma came often, sometimes to sit in the kitchen and sketch in silence, other times to tell me stories about the women in her art history cohort, most of whom didn't know what to do with their freedom. She said it without judgment, just observation. They mistake ownership for direction, she said once, peeling an orange with precise fingers. They think having the pen means they know how to write the story. I looked at her then, this granddaughter of mine, and wondered if some of our wisdom had reached her despite the detours, not as advice, but as presence. She didn't speak about her father much, neither did I. We let the silence hold what words couldn't improve. One morning, I stood outside the guest house with a fresh basket of supplies, new pencils, a small heater, and extra blankets folded neatly in my arms. Flora had asked if she could bring a friend, someone who hadn't touched a book in 20 years, but knew how to repair engines by sound alone. Of course, I said, and meant it. The guest house had become more than a repurposed structure. It was a sanctuary, stitched together by choices, some painful, some defiant, all deliberate. Every Tuesday and Friday, stories unfolded beneath its roof. No one asked who I was to them. They didn't need to. My name was spoken with care, and my presence didn't have to be proven. Around mid-December, the community center invited me to speak at their winter gathering. Nothing formal, just a short reflection, a way to close the year. I almost declined. Not because I was afraid of speaking, but because so much of my life had already been lived aloud in service of others. I wasn't sure what I still had to say. But that night, sitting in the living room with the house silent and my gold bracelet catching firelight, I opened the stitched journal Emma had given me and wrote a sentence I hadn't expected. You can lose everything you gave and still have yourself. That became the seed of the speech. The gathering was small. Folding chairs, paper cups, children dancing too close to the tree. Someone's toddler fell asleep halfway through a carol. When Candace introduced me, she didn't say retired or widowed or former. She just said, Linda Wallace knows what it means to carry a story and survive its ending. I stood before them in my silk blouse and steady shoes, gold bracelet resting like memory on my wrist, and I spoke not of losses but of returns. Of the difference between being cut out and choosing to walk out, of silence that heals rather than punishes, of building something from the ash heap of expectation. And when I finished, no one clapped right away. They just sat there, as if something had settled across their shoulders. Then Flora stood up, eyes damp, and said, I thought it was too late for me, now I think it's not. And someone else said, Amen. What? Not to me, but to the space we'd all kept open. The next day, Emma brought by a framed print of one of her Paris sketches, The Seine in the Rain, loose strokes, soft gray paper. I thought it might belong here, she said, already scanning my walls. Over the fireplace, I told her. She hung it with care, not precision, but care. That night, I lit the fireplace, sat beneath the print, and opened my journal again. This house is no longer a holding place for pain, it's a home, even if no one else calls it one. Christmas came quietly. No parties, no invitations, no cards with grinning faces sent from addresses that once knew mine. But I was not forgotten. The women from the guest house brought jam. Emma made a wreath from pine and ribbon. Candace gifted me a heavy wool shawl, hand-woven by someone she knew from her mother's side. I placed the shawl on the back of my reading chair and pulled it over my shoulders as the sun dipped past the fence. And then, sometime just after twilight, a single envelope slipped through the mail slot. No return address. Inside was a photo. Daniel, years ago, holding Emma as a baby. They were laughing. It was genuine, unposed. On the back, 4 words, I see it now. That was all. No signature, no plea. Just that. I held it in both hands and let it rest in my lap. There are some apologies that arrive too late to fix the past, but not too late to be noticed. That night, I stood by the fireplace, journal closed, print above me, and held the photo for a moment before sliding it into a drawer. I didn't need to display it. I just needed to know it was mine.